and start. Again, welcome to Rebuilding the Church, Cultivating Creation Care. My name is Jamie Noyd, and I am the Director of Via Divina for Faculty. This webinar is part of our summer spiritual formation pilgrimage, Via Divina, the Franciscan Way, which I know some of you are participating in. It's also part of the faculty ministry summer series of webinars on rebuilding the church, which I know others of you are participating in. And it's co-hosted by our graduate and faculty ministry Western region, which I know others are here because of that. So thank you for whatever reason you came. We are glad that you are joining us this evening. And I want to go ahead and introduce you to Lisa Leo, who is the regional director for the GFM Western region.
Thanks, Jamie. It's my pleasure to introduce everyone to our main webinar speaker today, Isaiah Smith. Isaiah is an ethnobotanist and lecturer of botany and agriculture at Honolulu Community College on the island of Oahu. So for some of us, it's good evening, but for him and others, it's good afternoon right now. Isaiah studied botany at the University of Hawaii at Manoa with an emphasis on conservation and ecology, and he is a volunteer with InterVarsity Hawaii. So I'm extremely happy to have him here to share with us from his heart and his knowledge. And I'm also extremely happy that we get to have someone from Hawaii come and share with the rest of the country. So I'll turn it over to Isaiah.
All right, mahalo, Lisa. Share my screen real fast. But welcome to this talk and this time about talking about communing with God through creation care. This is something that this subject is something that's near and dear to my heart. I know is near and dear to many of my friends. And so this is an awesome thing to be able to talk about this subject and something that I think the church definitely could use more of in different ways, the greater church. And so I've already had some introduction from Lisa, but just to give some other background information, one thing that we like to do here in Hawaii is also talk about our ethnicities. And so something that we do just to kind of get to know someone better, like knowing where someone's from and like who they are and whatnot, it just helps us to better, just love on them. Basically, I feel like it's the root of it. And so I'm Japanese, Hawaiian, and many different kinds of Caucasian. And my family has been here in the islands, in the Hawaiian side, thousands of years, and the Japanese past 100 odd years, my Haole side, the white side, for a little over 100 years or 150 odd years or so. So born and raised in Hawaii, originally from Kona on the Big Island, so the biggest island, the most southern island of the chain. And my family there are coffee farmers. That's one of their many trades. My dad does a lot of things, but I grew up picking coffee and whatnot. So there's gonna be a lot of coffee and like garden and flower pictures in my slides. They mention most other things here and interest in botany. I do a lot of crafting too, so I love doing woodwork and the like. And heavily influenced by Japanese as well as Hawaiian art and material culture. Also to mention, I'm also part of IV's faculty ministry too. It's another plug. So partially why I was invited here. But yeah, mahalo for having me speak today. So jumping into things, what is creation care? I'm sure many of you have some idea already, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's a number of different things that no matter where you are, there's something that you can do in creation care. And one thing I wanted to address from the beginning is just why creation care is important. And part of it is being that we are made for creation care. And to begin with, we are made from creation. Whether you look at creation and the first man from being breathed into life, Adam being breathed into life from the soil, or if you're going from the more evolutionary side of things, either which way, we're from the creation itself. So we're not something exempt or separate from creation. And also, biblically, we are made for creation too. And so looking even at Genesis 2:15 and looking at how it says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. It shows that relationship that was built there by God himself between creation and humans. One thing I like to add, though, to this is the Hawaiian over here. So Hawaiian is one of the languages of one of my peoples, and it's something that I am learning more about. And sometimes if you look at other translations, you can see other layers you don't necessarily see in the English all the time. And so I want to focus on this last line, to work it and to take care of it, meaning the Garden of Eden. And in the Hawaiian, it says, "E mahi ai malama ia vahi." And so the word I'm focusing on here is mahi. And so mahi means to cultivate. And so I think it just gives a different vision of what it means to interact with the land. We're not just working the land, it's not something that's separate. We're just ordering around, but it's something that we are actively cultivating and helping to grow. And I feel like that's a healthier view, I think, of creation and creation care. All right, so these are some of the things we'll be talking about today. What can creation care do in our lives? Some things that maybe we've experienced already, but just haven't thought about and have put into words. But I think there's a lot of great ways that creation care can connect us with God and also with others. And so overall, it creates connections. I think it's one of the first things. So it creates connections to God, people, place, and even ourselves in different capacities, giving us that space to even work on ourselves and view ourselves in different ways, and even connecting us to our ancestors to a certain point. It can help to teach us lessons on life and the nature of God. And so we'll look at each of these different aspects today. But I feel like for me personally, it's a lot of things I learned from creation and while I'm caring for it. It also gives us space to experience God personally. And for me, I don't always necessarily hear from God necessarily while I'm praying as much. I mean, definitely sometimes, but I think especially when I'm praying out in creation, I feel like it's just easier for me to receive things. I feel like that's how God speaks to me a lot, just through creation. And so I think it's a wonderful way for others to hear personally from him. Yeah. So before getting into some of those details, I did want to talk about learning about creation and applying that knowledge. And I think for all of us here who are academia, it's kind of second nature. It's like we want to learn about things. So hopefully it's easy thing for us to do. But I think learning about creation has a lot of benefits and helps us to even care for creation well. And so learning about creation in your area can be very helpful in your steps towards learning how you might want to start creation care. These are a lot of good questions that maybe to think about. Also, I think another big component of this idea of creation care can also be considering who are the first peoples of the places that you live in, and how did they and how do they interact with creation today? So First Nation peoples have been in many of these places for many millennia, sometimes tens of thousands of years, if not more. And through that time, their cultures have just often tightly connected with the land. And so they have a much better world knowledge of what the land needs, how the land should be, and how that area works. And so I think going into Native communities, going to First Nations people and learning more about their stories, about the plants that are important to them and whatnot, can be very, very helpful. Also, learn about the threats to creation in your area. For me, being conservation background, you realize just how everything's in threat all the time. And so on a global scale, we have global warming, right? We have climate change. We have so many things that are coming against a lot of our natural spaces. And so learning about what's threatening your space specifically can help guide you towards caring for creation well. Just to point out one example here, this little plant, this picture here, these little seedlings are ohialehua trees. And if you're in the forest and you see them walking around, you might even step on them because they're so small and don't seem like much. But these trees are very important for our Hawaiian forests. These are the plants that help to make up most of our watersheds. This is the plant that fed many of our native birds. And so just knowing that the role that this plant plays in this ecosystem helps you to care for it better, even by simply not stepping on it. All right, and so these next few parts I want to look at God's timing. And I think this is something that for me, over and over again, I see God speaking to me through creation. Creation care can help us kind of figure out what is God's timing and come into his timing. And so it helps to teach us about the natural ebb and flow of the seasons. And so for you up in the continent, I feel like it's a little easier because everything changes so drastically. Here in Hawaii, it's a little bit more nuanced, but after a while, you do get to see these different rhythms and things that happen throughout the year. It also teaches about cycles of life and death, something we don't always necessarily talk about as much, especially in some parts of the Western world. So even going to like the famous line from Ecclesiastes 3:1-8, I won't go through all of it, but basically talking about there's a season for everything, right? And so just as there's seasons in the natural world, there's seasons in our own lives that we have to consider and we'll go through. And of course, patience. I feel like patience is the ever important thing to learn, and nature definitely teaches you a lot of patience, no matter what you're doing. And also, creation can teach us about rest and Sabbath, what that can look like, and even how nature needs to rest as well. So me growing up on a coffee farm, this is what I kind of know. And so there's many different versions of this, of different kinds of crops you can use, but this is the one that I chose. And I think looking at God's timing and looking at creation, and when you care for creation, you learn about different rhythms of life. You learn about times of pruning. Pruning can be, for you, changes in our lives, cutting out old habits and refocusing energies in many cases. There's times of growth when you have maybe personal growth, for example, whatever form that may come in. Flowering is kind of different. Flowering, to me at least, is a time of being receptive. So this is when flowers are getting pollinated, so it's accepting things from other places. So this could be a time of relearning things, of re-educating yourself. This could be a time of reassessing different situations and hearing from others. But all of this is in preparation for the next stage, for fruiting, when we have those final products that we are putting out, which could be things in work, it could be things in ministry, but the final fruits of all that time and effort that we have put in. Yeah. And so one example of one of these stages that I witnessed very recently is pruning. And so this picture here is actually from my yard. This is a starfruit tree, a very common fruiting tree throughout parts of South and Southeast Asia. It's a really tasty fruit. Many people like it here in Hawaii. And this tree, this branch, if you look at it, it looks very nice and happy and healthy. It actually has tons of other fruit. There's probably about 30 pounds of fruit on this single branch. And so it looks superficially okay, but what happens, if you have too much fruit sometimes, the branches crack. And so it was a little bit windy, but also this branch was just overloaded with fruit. And I think, to me, this is a way that Keoku was talking to me about work and about fruit. Like, I think especially for many people in society in the West, and especially even academia, you're constantly being pressured, like, you got to produce as much fruit as possible. You got to put out as much papers. You got to get this research done and pump all of this out. And it's just all about like what you can do and about producing tons of it. But that's not always the healthiest thing. God teaches us about pruning and the ways that we need to sometimes cut back different aspects of our life, that we should be focusing on maybe a few things. And by doing so, we end up preventing situations like this, which I feel like is burnout, which I think is a very prevalent theme in many people's lives today, unfortunately. But yeah, I think that's one way nature can speak to us as we care for creation. Rest and Sabbath is another facet of nature. And there's different natural cycles that we go through throughout the years. And seeing this can be a reminder for us that we need to also rest. Up in the continent, you have winters and you have deciduous trees that drop their leaves, right? Here in Hawaii, we have a few examples of plants that also go through these kinds of dormancy stages. And I think it's a good reminder that life isn't always going. There's times for rest. There's times that we need to just stop and just be, and to reserve our energies for something else in the future. And it's something that's biblical too. God tells us we need to Sabbath and rest, no matter how many papers we have to grade. Another aspect of God's timing that especially that I've struggled with in the past is this idea of life and death. And it's something I think in Western culture we avoid a lot. Like a lot of focus today in modern culture tends to be on youth and like that kind of that stage of life. And we don't as often focus on death, and we don't have as many practices in place that allow for good mourning sometimes and accepting of death. And I think growing plants, growing annuals like these beautiful cosmos, my favorite flowers, can be a way for us to acclimate and just see the natural cycles that death is a part of. And not only looking at death from that aspect, but also seeing it as part of the cycles that allow for more life to come. And so even Jesus talking about how the wheat has to die, right? The grain has to die before the new plant can come. Similarly, these flowers have to get pollinated, they'll drop, but they also produce seed, which will give you the next generation of flowers. So I think it's another way that we can be taught and blessed by creation and commune with God. Creation care can also be a space of meditation and healing, I think, for many. And partially because creation care can be mindless in a good way. And so depending what you're doing, of course, sometimes creation care can be pretty blah, as far as like thinking wise, whatever. But I appreciate it because it gives more mental space, I think. Creates this quiet space where you can have things like meditation and reflection upon different parts of your life. It can help you to even relax and focus in different ways. I know for me, growing up, again, going back to coffee, here's some coffee beans on the branch. You're out there for hours in the hot sun and you're picking coffee, and after a certain point, it gets automatic. And so you find your mind just wandering and you're thinking, you're planning, you're doing all these other things. And so it can be a perfect time for meditating on God's word. It could be a perfect time to even be praying and seeing what God wants to say to you in that time. For me, I think I just like to always be doing something with my hands. And so I think even doing something helps me to focus mentally, like keeping my hands preoccupied. So creation care can be wonderful in that way too. Not to mention greenery by its nature is naturally very calming. Scientists have seen and proven that the color green for the most part is calming to most people. Just viewing greenery can be very helpful. And so partially because we probably used to be in forest at some point. Not to mention that it can be healing for those who have gone through trauma. And so many different people who go into like therapy and whatnot actually have gardening programs for people who have gone through different sorts of trauma. And just that act of cultivating and caring for nature can be just so healing for them. Yeah. And creation care can also be helpful in maintaining our physical vessels, exercising, kind of a dirty word for me. But I don't always love necessarily to exercise, but I like to be in creation to care for it. And this definitely can be a really good way to work your body. And so even the other week, I was at a lo'i, or a taro patch that my friend is working at and helping out at. And we were in the mud. We were trudging around using muscles that I have not used for many weeks, if not months, and pushing and pulling things, weed whacking, all kinds of stuff. And at the next day, I definitely felt it in my body. But you know that that's a good thing, right? And so if you feel it, it's like, oh, you're actually using your body. And that's something that God wants for us, right? God wants us to be able to have healthy, happy bodies so we can live long and healthy lives. Creation care can also be a means of joining in Keakua's work of restoration. God is a God of restoration. So looking at like at Isaiah 58, talking about the prophecy about rebuilding the ancient ruins and raising up the ancient foundations and repairing broken walls. These can be things that are not necessarily structural. I mean, these are supposed to be metaphorical here, but even with creation care, we can do different forms of restoration. Restoration of itself can be a prayer. It can be something that is even a prophetic act in different ways. And you can even pray while caring for your creation. And so even going back to that, talking about the lo'i, for instance, the lo'i, that taro patch. The taro patch for many of us is something that is symbolic, I think, of sovereignty in many ways, or is also a symbol of like the Hawaiian people. Today, it's very hard to get taro. It used to be our staple food, and it's very good for us and healthy for us. And so every time you're building a lo'i, you're helping fix one and repairing one and planting something, it's kind of like this prophetic act towards the stability of our people and better health for our people overall. So it can be a wonderful part of creation care. And it also gives us the opportunity to work alongside God in creation, even as Adam and Eve did. Yeah. We also can see qualities of God through creation. And so even looking at Romans 1:20, talking about how we have no excuse. Creation is all around us. We see the beauty of creation and see it, just all the things that he has made. And how can we say there's not a creator after looking at what's around us? And a lot of times for us, it's just a matter of seeking and taking time to be able to appreciate and see the elements of God in nature. I think at least for some of us in the bio, we're looking at creation and things like that. Sometimes we don't always have that sense of amazement because we've studied things so long. We've teased apart the proteins of the genes of a certain plant and whatnot. And so sometimes we lack that amazement, and sometimes we just get into our little bubbles of being stuck in an office somewhere. And so we don't get the time to really appreciate what God has created around us. And so through creation care, we can, I think it's, for me at least, it's helped to create a greater sense of amazement and wonderment and awe of the creator that sometimes we forget about. And it's also a reminder that we are a part of creation too, that we have this role and this place amongst this greater world and creation. Yeah. And so, I mean, as far as like how you can appreciate creation, there's so many different things. No matter where you are, I think there's always beauty in creation. Us here in Hawaii, I feel like we have a little bit more. No, we just have things that may be a little more visible at times. And so beautiful places like Mauna Kea, a place that's been sacred to the Hawaiian people for millennia. It's something that you're going there, you just feel that spiritual presence of God and just the beauty of everything that he has made. And even looking at the small things, I like to look at the small things a lot. And so simple things like flowers and like even bees interacting with flowers is just something that's so interesting and just so wonderful to see. Something I know kids really appreciate a lot, but not as many adults, I think, sometimes. Yeah, and so sometimes we see the quality of God through creation. Sometimes God is speaking through creation to us directly. And so the more that we are in creation care, there's more opportunities that can happen for us to interact with God through that creation. There's many different instances in the Bible where God has used creation to act upon a person and or just speak directly to a person. So of course, one of their favorites is the talking donkey, but many different ways that creation can speak to us. And oftentimes, all it takes to hear God through creation is to ask God for something. It is just to be in creation and asking him to speak to you through it, and just being still enough and quiet enough to observe what is happening around us. A lot of times it's changing how we look at things, changing our mindsets about what it is to be spoken to by God. And after a while, I think if you get more familiar with it, or as we say in Hawaiian, you start seeing things everywhere. You start seeing the beauty and the things that God's trying to say to you in the environment all around you. And so one example of this, that story that I really think is special, is the story about a sparrow. And so this story is actually from a pastor that's over here in Hawaii that I know. And his wife tragically passed away. It was a sudden freak accident, and it was something that really hit him hard. But at the funeral, he was speaking, he told this story to everyone. And so there's one day that he was in his church, and then all of a sudden the sparrow flew in, and it started freaking out and started hitting the glass windows and flying all over the place like birds do. And he just saw this bird and he felt so like sad for it. It's like, no, come. And he's trying to like usher the bird out the door and trying to save it and prevent it from hurting itself. And eventually he got it out that door. And in that moment, as the bird flew away, he suddenly realized something in this act of care for creation, that, oh, like he felt that God was speaking to him through that image, that he's like that bird, that in that time that he's grieving, he's going through this loss, everything seems crazy, nothing makes sense. He feels like he keeps hitting walls, doesn't know where to go. But that God's right there with him and trying to usher him to safety, that he's there with him in that room. And no matter where he's flying, like he's there and he's trying to help him to get out. And that eventually he will get out and that he'll be okay. And I think that's just a beautiful reminder of God's like heart towards us. So I know I've talked a lot, so I want to take a little time for everyone to be able to talk story, as we say Hawaii a little bit. And so I have this question for you as you go onto your breakout rooms. In your group, share about how did God speak to you through creation? What was the time you felt you were spoken to? And what was he saying? So it'll take about 5 minutes or so to get into go into these breakout rooms. And yeah, I hope you have a good time of sharing with one another. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you all had an awesome time of sharing your testimonies with one another and your stories. I think it's always something that's good to hear, right? It's a good testimony and in ways that God's is speaking to us. All right. So moving on, I think another great facet about creation care, which I know speaks to me a lot, is creation care in the heart of God. And so by caring for the land, by caring for the Aina, we're able to connect more, I think, with God's nurturing heart and understand him better in many ways. And so even looking at Luke 12, there's several parts that are actually very applicable to this, but one part of talking about the ravens and how God feeds the ravens and like they survive, they're happy, they're healthy. So how much more valuable are we to him? So how much more that he's going to help us and support us in our times of need. So why should we worry? I think creation care can also give us more compassionate hearts towards others. And I mean, seemingly, at least watching the news, the world's definitely in need of a lot more compassion in many ways. And I think by growing things, by raising things, by helping to care for creation, I think that inherently helps to create more compassion for others and one another. And even though it's sometimes easier to love a plant than a person, I think it's very helpful. It also helps to reflect the idea that God wants us to grow, thrive, and be fruitful, just the same way that we want our plants to grow, thrive, and be fruitful when we care for them. And so one example being when I plant seeds or plant cuttings and whatnot, like I know for me at least, I get very excited when I see something just first start to germinate or grow. It's like, yay, it's a success. Like it's not dead. And I think I like to believe that God has that same kind of joy with us. When he sees us grow, when he sees us thrive, it gives him joy. It makes him happy to see us happy and to see us growing in the ways that he has made us. These last few parts are going to focus a lot on people. And I think we think about creation care and like I mean, you can focus on that part of it, but I think creation care can also be a great way to love on people and God's people. It can help us to commune with God by showing love to others. And that's definitely one of the major points of God, right? He is love and wants to love people. For many people in the world, Malama Aina is something of primary focus for them. So especially here in Hawaii, Malama Aina is something that many people value, but maybe they might not value God very much at the same time. Maybe they're not Christians per se. But as we love on Aina, as we love on the land and creation, we're able to show this facet of God that maybe they didn't see before, and to show that God cares about these different places in their lives too. And this can be a number of different ways, through restoration of different places, protection of sacred places too. And doing those things, we're able to love on people who love the land. So one example of this is this picture here is from the campsite at Mauna Kea. And so if you haven't heard about this before, but Mauna Kea is that picture we saw earlier, right? That beautiful mountain, sometimes covered in snow. That beautiful mountain is also a place that's very sacred to the Hawaiian people. And in recent years, there's been this big movement by certain astronomers to build this huge brand new fancy telescope on there. But it's something that many people in the community, and especially Native Hawaiians, don't want up there, since it is this sacred site. And to build it on there would be a sort of desecration. Not to mention there's also risks even to our watershed or water sources if they were to build it there. And so there are many people that got together as protectors to stand against this, and in a very loving and very beautiful way, I must say. If you want to learn more about this, talk to Makaiba Kanui, if you haven't met her already, one of my good friends. But she's lived on the mountain and experienced it in full. And we actually got to go there as a church at one point, our church called Hano Ke Aloha. We went there in support of these protectors, and we went there to learn, to love on them, and also to be a part of them. Like, we are one of them too. And so going there, I think, really helped us to love on the people that are there, show that God cares about these things. And also we got to see different facets of God that we might have not otherwise have seen. Many people that I've met that have gone there say like, oh, it felt almost like heaven in a way, because everyone was working together in so much love and community. And most of these people are not Christians. Many of these people believe in other gods even. But we're able to see the fingerprints of God in their lives and the ways that they loved others so deeply and so selflessly. And so I think creation care can definitely be a way that we can enter into these kinds of spaces. Creation care can also be a way of blessing others as well, a way to bless our communities around us. One way that I like to bless my community is by growing plants. Propagating plants is something that's really fun for me. And so this is a picture of my greenhouse. This is pre-pandemic though, now it's not as productive, but this is our greenhouse on campus at HCC. And something that I did that I wasn't even told to do, but I just felt like, oh, I just want to grow plants. And so I started growing tons and tons of these different native plants and food plants and things. And at a certain point, I had just a lot of them. I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do with these. And then we ended up having, we have this thing every year called a Holalea celebration. And I was invited, it's like, oh, why don't we give away your plants? And so since that first time, we've given plants away almost every year that we were on campus. And it's something that really is such a blessing to people, and something that really makes people feel loved and appreciated, I think, by receiving something like, simple thing like a little plant. It helps us to connect to God's generous nature. So even besides these kinds of plants, if you have like a fruit tree or a garden, oftentimes you have overabundance of fruit, you can bless others that are around you. And that reflects that generous heart of Keapua. It can even help with issues of food security. So many places, unfortunately, in the world, even in the US, we have, the US has issues with food security. You have food deserts and things like that. And so by having your own personal garden, you can help to, make up for that. You can help to bless others with something as simple as a few tomatoes, and not to mention too, that by loving on people in this capacity, and even in the previous slide, going to places and being protectors, we help to build trust with communities that maybe otherwise wouldn't have been open to having relationship with Christians. You can have a whole talk just on that. All right, so which brings us to looking at our church communities. So we can do a lot of stuff on our individual level, which I highly encourage, but what are ways that we can encourage and mobilize the greater church to do more in creation care? I think one thing would be definitely to look into learning about the needs of your communities, your surrounding areas, the forests, just the people around you, like what are their needs and how does it relate to creation care? Things like community gardens can be very helpful in blessing others. Even looking at a neighbor, I think is something that happens a lot. You see maybe an elderly neighbor trying to like mow their lawn by themselves, or have this huge yard and they don't have anyone to help them out. I think that's one beautiful way to help and bless another person through creation care. Many of our churches have retreats in natural places in creation. And so when we do these kinds of outings and these kinds of retreats, is there a way that we can add a component of creation care to that, and just help to expose more people to that sort of activity? Creation care can also help to build relations with people of the land and assist them in the care of creation. So again, kind of going to like native peoples, or people who are in these fields that are involved with creation care, and asking them what are the needs of the land. So I took the time a little bit. Okay, I think I have enough time to talk about this a bit. So this is actually a picture of many members of my church. We're a small family church here in Hawaii, and one of the things that we've been doing more lately is doing a lot of creation care in different ways. And this area that we're in here is called Hunananiho. It's a place in Waimanalo in Oahu. And this place, the issue there was they're trying to develop the area. They're trying to build this whole big brand new park thing, and many people are against in the community, and many fear that this would lead to greater gentrification. And so many people were against it. And so many members of our church actually stood with the people that were protecting this area. And we even moved our church there. We actually started meeting in a tent outside in this area alongside those who were occupying that space. And so by being there, not only were we were able to just bless the people there and help the community, but also we helped to build bridges between the community and build bridges between the church and people who might not call themselves believers. And even though the people there, some of them people we know might not say, oh, we're Christians outright, I do believe that by our presence being there, it greatly changed their viewpoint of what it is to be a Christian and what Christianity looks like to them, rather than being this oppressor, which it has been that way for many centuries, unfortunately, for a lot of Native peoples. It's now this advocate for them. And so I think that's one really great way that creation care can bless the community. But in summary, so we're going towards the end, I want to make sure you have enough time to talk story a little bit. So some things we touched upon, just to review, we're made from and for creation, right? So the Bible tells us. Creation care often goes hand in hand with some of these many different types of ways that we can connect with others. It can go well beyond caring for creation itself. And it's very holistic in many ways, I would like to say, as far as the effects that can happen when we care for creation and have that that intention behind it of also involving God in that creation care. So for those of us who are still thinking about how we might be able to incorporate creation care into our own spiritual lives, pray about it. Pray about something you can do on your own or with others. Watch, listen, and feel creation, and try to sense what God may be speaking to you, even on your own in your quiet times. Even those simple initial steps can lead to great change and hopefully more creation care in your everyday life. So yeah, mahalo and blessings. Yeah. Any questions or comments or anything? That's it for my talking. Yeah, I could say a huge amount more, but I want to make sure I can hear from everyone.
So if you have a question, you could put it in chat. I think, or raise your hand. And you can unmute yourself as well and just ask. So we'd love to hear your questions. Or even stories of how you have been involved in creation care.
Yep. Michelle?
I was just wondering if you have suggestions of like how you could sort of invite people in who really don't think creation care is important, particularly those in the Christian church. I'm just curious if you have suggestions for that.
Yeah, I know sometimes that can be hard. It reminds me of this one time that I was in college where one of my friends who's really into creation care was talking about like, oh, what if we had like missions to go to forests and replant areas out? And then someone said, deliver this, like, oh, I hope that doesn't happen. And it's like, what? It's like they're really against the idea and feeling like it was a waste of time. And it's like, oh, that's so sad. But yeah, so anyway, as far as ways to invite people, I think if you can connect it with ministry for one in some way, I think that's an easy way. I think people in the church tend to be like very focused on ministry and about like, oh, how can we reach people? And which is a good thing, right? Something that God wants. And so if you can tie that aspect into it somehow, I think that's a great way to encourage the church to participate in creation care, or addressing some community need. Like again, we talked about like even food and things like that, like starting a garden together as a church to specifically maybe help a houseless shelter or something, or even like widowers or people who may not have as much resources to access food easily. That could be another way to encourage the church.
One way that we encourage the church of the elders, Isaiah took us on a walk around the University of Hawaii where there were Hawaiian plants, and the participants are from our church, and they're all, you know, older and or retired, and they thought that was the best thing because they saw all these plants, but they didn't know the meaning of it. They didn't understand the name or anything. So I think just seeing it and giving information, being out in the open, they really, really enjoyed it. Do you remember, Isaiah?
No, yeah, that was a good time. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, education can be a means too. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of a church. Like our church, I feel is very different. So it's like somewhat easier to mobilize because we're small. So bigger church, I don't have as many examples that I've already seen.
I'm intrigued by this question in chat here, asking if you envision that we could ordain creation care ministers or earth keepers to lead and serve in their communities.
Wow, that'd be very interesting. It's kind of like we have, like, I'm just trying to think about, we have people like that. In some ways, even in IV, we have people who are like justice ministries, and even though it's the focus is justice overall, like a lot of their focus is actually on creation care focused justice. And so in a way, we already have that in our own circles. But I mean, that'd be lovely. Like, I mean, that'd be awesome if we had a role like that. I mean, it's definitely a need, I think, in many spaces for that. Convincing the greater church to do that, I don't know, that might be a little hard initially, at least. Oh, cool.
Regarding the creation care ministry, I recognize that we put people in a seminary and they study the Bible in Greek and Latin and Hebrew and systematic theology for several years. And then we officially ordain them and give them the title of pastor or reverend, and they can speak with great authority about the issues based on the Bible. I'm thinking that if we learn about God both from the Bible and from creation, it would be helpful to have somebody with a authority from God as ordained to speak on behalf of the creation for the care and the preservation of the landscape, which is being run over with housing developments and highways and impervious surfaces. And there's so much to be led in that, and going to government agencies with the authority that one has as being ordained as a creation care minister or as an earth keeper.
Yeah, that'd be really. Sorry. Yeah, I think that'd be something that'd be really awesome if we had a role like that in the church. Maybe we could talk about making that some way. I don't know how how I'd like to go about that. I'm not as much in like, I think the ordained minister scene, so I don't know the processes of whatnot, but it would be awesome to have ministers who are at least, maybe that's their heart focus. Yeah. and leading out others to that as well.
I think a way could be to offer, your community garden outcome to maybe a food pantry, because they don't have, a lot of times they don't have fresh vegetables and fruits and that kind of thing. And that would be, a ministry that may already be a Christian ministry, and you're just adding to that. And that would be, maybe your church doesn't necessarily need it, but your community at large does.
Yeah, I think that'd be an awesome way to bless others and to encourage creation care.
I know that even as I drive around, sometimes I see fruit trees that are just loaded with fruit, but the owners of the trees just don't have the time or physical capacity to harvest all the fruit. So there's just all this rotting fruit on the ground. So I wonder if it could be a service to the owners of the trees, if they're Christians who go around offering to harvest, and then to be able to take it to food banks or shelters or dropping them off at senior centers and such.
Yeah, that'd be something awesome. I don't know if it was here in Hawaii or I saw somewhere else, but there was something like that though, where like people offered like for free, we'll come to your yard, we'll pick your excess fruit and we're gonna give it out to others for free. So if you had Christian versions of that, yeah, that'd be awesome. And definitely I feel bad when I see rotting fruit on the ground. Some people's houses, like, oh no, so good. Even going off the idea, even to make it last longer, making preserves, if people had the capacity and time, like so that it could stretch even longer and spread even more to more people.
In my community during the pandemic, there was a new Buy Nothing group, on Facebook, which is like sharing all of your stuff. And then it split into 3 different groups. And there was one lady who didn't want it to split because she worked at a bakery, and she was very passionate about having no food waste, because food waste is so bad for the environment, whether it's, fresh produce or prepared food. And so she created a separate Facebook group for our whole city called Fighting Food Waste. And it's like the coolest thing ever. Like all throughout the day, I just get messages like, I made too much of this, or I have this much fruit, or I work at a restaurant and we have this, or so it's just really amazing to me how impactful her little Facebook group is. I think it has like over 800 members. And so there's one guy who said he didn't buy food since the Facebook group started. So anyway, I just thought I feel like that's such a practical example of just a local person just activating a whole network of sharing that. And then she like collects people's scraps for compost. And like, we've learned that like after Halloween, when your pumpkins are going bad, there's certain animals that are pets that eat pumpkins. So it's been a huge educational experience. So be neat for some other people to try that.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful way to bless the community and build community also. Like building relationships to me, I think is a great side thing from creation care. And especially when sometimes you can feel very lonely at different times between the city, maybe by yourself, or maybe if you don't have a close-knit family where you are, like this can create, families of sorts through these connections that we create. Oh, cool. Can you do that, Lisa? If you have the link. Yeah, I know there's more free groups nowadays. Even I know Brennan is very into that.
Yeah,
I have the free groups and there's all kinds of things.
It's local, so I don't think you can join it if you don't live where I live. But you could get the idea from the rules or whatever. So I will do that right
now. Where do you live, Lisa? Which community are you talking about?
Monrovia, California. It's outside of Pasadena. Yeah. Just one lady just made a huge difference. Very cool.
I think it's the wonderful thing too about creation care. Like I think there's so many instances, at least that friends that I know, like it just starts off with one person, and it just takes that one spearhead to really start the momentum, and then people just see how great it is and just come together and work towards that end. Yeah.
Well, Isaiah, I want to take the time to thank you very much for sharing with us about creation care and all this. I know it has opened up my eyes and heart and soul of the breadth of creation care and what that really can do in cultivating our connection with God, as well as the wider world, and at some level rebuilding the church. Yeah, being
Oh.
part of that renewal. So thank you, and thank you,
Yeah, no
Lisa,
problem.
and the rest of GFM West for organizing this, and Brennan for your translation in the chat. Yeah, it fits so well in with the story of Francis that we're following in making peace with creation, and yeah, praising God through that creation again. So thank you so much. I do want to give a couple of announcements and then a blessing in the last minute that we have. Just a reminder for those who are doing the Franciscan way that this Thursday at 8 Eastern, we are having a liturgy of joy, and next Tuesday at 2 Eastern is our closing celebration, and you'll learn more about that in the email that goes out tomorrow. And so I want to send off folks with a blessing. This is the familiar prayer of St. Francis, which was actually written centuries after Francis, but it really incorporates, a lot of that idea of, making peace throughout the world, and that whole idea of sowing that connects with the land. So let me read this as our final blessing. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Again, thank you all for joining us this